Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
Tonight I'm going to talk about global anger and several themes. Why now? Why is it all happening now? And why does the world hate us so much, hate the United States so much? A few years ago at Thanksgiving dinner, a friend of mine from the former Yugoslavia, actually she was from Macedonia, was talking about the terrible things the Croats did to them. And I said, well, I've been away from the newspapers for a couple of days. What exactly happened? No, she said, she was talking about something 500 years ago. So I realized that a lot of these hatreds around the world go back hundreds and hundreds of years. And today what we're experiencing is a head-on collision between history, politics, and passion. And I'm going to talk about a couple of the themes and a couple of the reasons that I think, I mean, it's happening for a lot of reasons, but I'm going to talk about a couple of major ones that we identified in this book. The first and the most important is that there's been an end to the Cold War. And we all know that. We all remember the TV clips of chipping away at the Berlin Wall. But what this means for us is that, first of all, the Cold War had tamped down all these ethnic and regional conflicts over the years, and after the Cold War, it's almost as if many of these conflicts reared up once more, free of the hostilities that were inherent in the Cold War. Now there are 14 conflicts raging throughout the world, and some seem pretty inexorable, such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the second thing that the Cold War brought is that now the United States is the only remaining superpower standing. And that has created a great deal of confusion. For example, what responsibilities does the U.S. have? What should its foreign policy be? When should it intervene? And how should it intervene? And how does all this relate to U.S. interests? Is it all making the world safe for Halliburton, or are there other interests involved? Also, another reason for all this world anger is the rise of fundamentalism and the rise of anti-Semitism, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And of course, the final theme is that the knowledge that I believe in, and that is that most conflicts are really geopolitical. Dictators need scapegoats. They need to find the other, anyone who's different, and people, in a sense, have to be taught to hate. I defy anyone to really tell me the genesis and the reasons for the Sunni-Shiite conflict. It goes back 1,400 years, and people are still upset about it. Why is it so important today? And I think when you think about it, you realize that most of these old battles are manipulated for all the wrong reasons: land, money, and power. Well, first of all, let's take the end of the Cold War. To a large extent, U.S. foreign policy itself is a cause of a lot of the anger around the world. And this surprises us because the U.S. is not a real colonial power. As a matter of fact, we were a colony ourselves just a couple of hundred years ago. Yet we're lumped with the major colonial powers, the United Kingdom, France, Portugal. Why? Because to a large extent we're allied with them, and to a lesser extent we really help them. In Iran, for example, in 1953, we helped the British depose a popularly elected president, Mohammad Mossadegh. And I think many people say that's the genesis of our problems in the Middle East today. Secondly, we're now engaged in what's called a doctrine of preemptive war. In other words, the current administration has been very eloquent on this subject, and it means that if the president feels that we should go to war, to prevent weapons of mass destruction or any other reasons, we can go to war. And we seem to have forgotten about the very basic fact that in our Constitution it says that only Congress can declare war by a majority vote. Yet we've had 5 major wars since World War II. And Congress doesn't seem to be worried about this. In other words, Congress has gone AWOL on this issue, and that's a big problem that nobody seems to realize. Congress passed the War Powers Act in 1973, which said in effect, "Please, Mr. President, tell us at least when you're going to go to war. We'd like to know." And I think the War Powers Act is kind of ridiculous because Congress gave the president 60 days to tell them when he's, if he's engaged in a violent act, and you can really destroy the world many times over in 60 days. So I think that the War Powers Act is really kind of a joke. And in other words, the U.S. is really what's called a hegemonic power today, and I don't think that we quite know what that means. We have a confusion in our in administrative ranks about what is military power. Do we bomb countries into submission? Well, we've done that in Iraq and we've done that in Afghanistan. And that policy has belatedly turned into hearts and minds. We're there to win the hearts and minds of people. Ironically, that's the title of the chapter on U.S. foreign policy in our book. And now it's a policy, but I don't think that the administration was reading this, unfortunately. Can we bomb countries into submission and then engage in nation building? I'm not sure. I don't think the two really go together. But I think that the real problem in this country with our foreign policy is that we do feel we have a responsibility for implementing freedom, but we don't quite know how to do that. What is nation building? Well, after World War II, MacArthur, who was no saint, was the head of the occupation in Japan, and he insisted that he insisted on a few things that make us realize that we haven't really learned anything in 50 years. Now, Iraq is not Japan, and there are lots of differences, but he did some very critical things that I think we could learn from today and haven't. For one thing, he refused to allow war profiteers from coming in, and he only used indigenous business to rebuild Japan. So contrast that with the Bechtels and the Halliburtons, and there's quite a contrast there. He also created a constitution that guaranteed women's rights and labor rights, and he also had clout with the Pentagon. He said to the Pentagon, or his buddies in the Pentagon, "Give me bread or give me bullets," because he realized if he didn't feed Japan, he would have to engage in another military endeavor there. In other words, he also went to the emperor. He learned he learned the language. He went to the emperor, and the emperor, the grateful emperor, went on the radio and told the people of Japan that he was not God. Well, it might be obvious to us that the emperor of Japan was not God, but it meant a great deal at the time, and was the difference between a successful occupation and what we're now witnessing in Iraq. We've also, as a country, and another critical part of U.S. foreign policy is that we've abandoned our notions of human rights. And there are lots of things that have appeared in the newspapers and that I'm sure you're well familiar with, but I think that message has gone out around the world and has been very deleterious for U.S. foreign policy. A story came out in the Washington Post that Dana Priest revealed that the CIA, because of the niceties of human rights that we have in the laws in this country, shipped prisoners off to other countries where they could be tortured. And that is a policy that we're not particularly proud of. You all know about Abu Ghraib, and you all know about the famous Gonzales memo, which stated that the U.S. did not have to abide by the Geneva Conventions for prisoners of war. And what we did was we just changed the name of prisoners of war to enemy combatants. And this argument just didn't fly worldwide. It shouldn't fly in this country either. Another problem that has exacerbated this world anger is the rise of fundamentalism and the relationship of fundamentalism to terrorism. And when you start to look at fundamentalism and what fundamentalism means, we have fundamentalism in the Islamic world, we have it in Judaism, and we have it in Christianity. But Islam, Christianity, and Judaism are all Abrahamic religions. They regard Abraham as their father. They worship from one book. They have a code of conduct. And instead of these three Abrahamic religions coming together, we've seen a real tearing apart that has resulted in the kind of fundamentalist thinking in each of these religions. And the real problem with all fundamentalists is that they feel they have the sole ownership of the truth. They have one book, they have one code of conduct, one land or one country, one set of laws. And the problem, I think, is that it freezes religion at one point in time. And religion isn't like that. Religion is kind of flexible. And it also reduces each religion to one prophet and one leader, and some very silly rules. The Amish, for example, can wear buttons but not zippers. If you read Leviticus, the Old Testament, it says that we can kill teenagers who are rude to their parents, and also admonishes us not to wear flax in the fields. Well, that's pretty irrelevant, isn't it? I don't even know what flax is, and my line of work doesn't require me to go into the fields, thank goodness. But the real problem here is that you have fundamentalists in this country. We have the evangelicals who have considerable political influence now. There are fundamentalists in Israel. Rabin's assassin said God told him to kill Rabin, and you got the same rhetoric from the fellow who killed 29 people praying in the mosque. And then you have Islamic fundamentalism, which really terrifies many people in this country because it is so highly linked to terrorism. And what are the problems with Islamic fundamentalism? First of all, Islam needs a state to survive. Islam it's almost a theocracy. You need a state in order to enforce a set of laws. Secondly, there are 1 billion Muslims in the world, and if 1% of them commit to a fundamentalist agenda, that leaves a pretty large recruitment pool for suicide bombers. You also have a conflict in Islam between the greater jihad and the lesser jihad, and those who believe in the greater jihad want to kill the infidels, remove them from the land, and it leads straight from that kind of theory to the terrorism that we're also frightened of and that we experienced with 9/11. Also in the Arab world, there is the question of the legitimization of protest. Many people in the Muslim world cannot protest corrupt leaders, unemployment, or any of the things that are really troubling many of these countries, but they can criticize the United States and they can criticize Israel. And they can also criticize blasphemy, which of course has occurred throughout the world and was recently in the newspapers in the Danish cartoon incident, in which many Muslims felt that the cartoons of Muhammad disrespected the religion and protested. But the real question here is, where do these protests originate? How long does it take? The Danish cartoon incident originated in Cairo, and it originated 6 months before the actual protest came about. So you wonder who is really engineering these protests, and to what extent are they seeking to divert populations from the real troubles affecting this part of the world. The irony of religious fundamentalism is that religion is really flexible. It does move with the times. And the holy books themselves contain many contradictions. In the Bible, just the Bible's interpretation of anger, how would you ever come to a fundamentalist interpretation if in one part of the Bible you read about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, or in the New Testament you may see Jesus calling for us to turn the other cheek. At the same time, you have an interpretation of anger that says, do not let the sun set on anger. So here are three very different interpretations of anger and the handling of anger in the Old and the New Testaments. The Quran has the greater and lesser jihads, and it has prohibitions against killing as well as explanations of the greater jihad. So you really have some very interesting conflicts in the holy books, and I think in all of the in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Quran, I think you can find these contradictions all over the place. So how do you get to be a fundamentalist, or what is fundamentalism? What is the true religion? I think in many of these cases you have a clash of cultures, not a clash of religion. In Darfur, you have Muslims against Muslims. Is that a clash of religion? It's really something very different. In Srebrenica, you had an ethnic war. You had 10,000 Muslim men that were killed in Srebrenica by the ethnic cleansers of that murdered them. In Northern Ireland, you have Catholics versus Protestant. Is that really a religious war, or is it an ethnic or geopolitical war? In the former Yugoslavia, you have all three. You have ethnic, geographical, political, but you do have, it all boils down to manipulated conflict. And if you look at Kosovo, if you look at Serbia, if you look at all of these countries and all of these conflicts, you will find elements of all three areas of conflict. And how do we interpret Iraq? The real irony is that religion is often an excuse for ethnic, tribal, and geopolitical conflict. And it's time we started interpreting that. Alas, the solution to all of this multiculturalism, which we celebrate and we favor in this country, and we went to Singapore a few years ago, and we were just delighted. I mean, Singapore has a lot of problems, and freedom of the press isn't there, and there are a lot of other things about Singapore that I didn't like, but I did love the fact that they celebrate diversity. They rotate the presidencies. They celebrate diversity in Singapore, and I think that it would be wonderful to see that in other countries. But multiculturalism is not a viable option in many parts of the world. Look at the headscarf controversy in France right now. France does not allow individuals to wear any symbol of religion in public buildings. So you can't wear a giant star, you can't wear a yarmulke on your head, you can't wear a big cross, and they have prohibited young Muslim women from wearing a headscarf to school, to public school. And they're having the same problems in Germany and Turkey, and they refuse to. We, on the other hand, in the United States, celebrate multiculturalism, and we wouldn't preclude individuals from wearing any kind of symbol to a public school. But you have to understand the cultures. France fought very hard to separate itself from the Catholic Church, and in 1905 they actually passed a law that declared their independence of the secular independence from the religious hierarchy, and this was a very hard fought and hard won law, and they really are adamant in maintaining the separation of church and state. I think that the United States doesn't quite understand this, because we were founded as a refuge from religious persecution. And the separation of church and state is a relatively recent phenomenon. I mean, we're just 200 years old, and we have many different religions and separate sects of religions, and it's written into our Constitution, the First Amendment, that we have a wall of separation between church and state. So that I think that, the whole study of religion in the world today is probably a front for other kinds of conflicts that are fought in the name of religion. One of the themes, another theme that really came out very strongly in researching this book was the theme of defeat. And this is the real problem with Islam. Islam suffered centuries of defeat and humiliation at the hands of the West, starting with the Crusades, and then Western civilization had the Renaissance, and then economic and technological development overtook them, and then, of course, the crowning blow was colonialism. And this was really a shock to Muslim countries, or countries that were predominantly Muslim, because Muslim culture and civilization had been dominant for 1,000 years before the Crusades, so that 11th to the 13th centuries, so that they couldn't quite understand how this part of the world was being supplanted by another part of the world. when I read a psychobiography of Osama bin Laden recently and learned, much to my surprise, that he had dreams of Saladin. Saladin was the one Arab hero in the Crusades. He was Egyptian, and he won the one battle won in that part of the world in the Crusades. It was interesting. It's always interesting to get out of the country and travel, because when I was teaching in Egypt many years ago, and I kept noticing the October 6th, the Victory Statue, the October 6th, the Victory Boulevard, the October 6th Victory Bridge, and finally I asked someone, what is the October 6th Victory? The October 6th Victory, much to my surprise, was known in the rest of the world as the Yom Kippur War. And what happened was that, as you all know, Egypt and Syria invaded Israel, almost like a pincer movement. And Egypt was very surprised by it crossed the Suez Canal, and if the world hadn't stepped in, if Henry Kissinger hadn't stepped in, Israel might not have come up with the stalemate that we now think of as the Yom Kippur War. Well, what was interesting about this was for the next few years, Sadat spun this as a victory for Egypt, and I suppose in a way it was. That battle was taught in Egyptian military academies for the next 20, 25 years as a victory. And the Egyptians, he managed to convince the Egyptians that this was a victory, and only on the wings of this victory could he fly to Jerusalem and sue for peace with Israel 5 years later in 1978. So I thought this was a very interesting incident in how, and one that was not known by, really little known by the rest of the world, that really took the Egyptian psyche and managed to turn it around and turn this stalemate into a victory. And only when they felt victorious, the Egyptian population, most of the people had felt very defeated at that point. They felt defeated from the 1968 war, from the 1948 independence of Israel, and the subsequent wars after that. And they were feeling extremely defeated and not in the least bit inclined to sue for peace or have a peace settlement with Israel. But in 1978, Sadat flew into Jerusalem, had a historic meeting in the Knesset with then Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and of course the rest is history. And every year he had a celebration. Ironically, Sadat was assassinated on the anniversary of the October 6th victory. But this theme comes in almost in every one of these 14 conflicts, and the theme of defeat is very, very important, because when people feel defeated, it's very, very hard to get them to come to the peace table and to negotiate any kind of peace. Look at the seemingly inexorable Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think that's rooted in defeat all around. The Israelis are coming, really, the memory of the Holocaust is still very strong in the minds of Israelis and Jews everywhere in the world. The Palestinians, for their part, feel very defeated because they've been in refugee camps, for many of them, for 3 generations. They were evicted from their homes. So you have two populations coming off very, very profound defeats. And that's why I think, that's one of the major reasons it's so hard to get the two of them to the bargaining table and to live side by side in peace. The last theme of all, I think, is the theme of politics, which is something that interests us all. And all of this world anger would never take place were it not for the complicity of us, of the industrialized world. And we have a chapter on Sierra Leone called Blood Diamonds. Again, that was published before the movie came out. But anyhow, that's the problem writing books. But Sierra Leone had a civil war that lasted for 10 years. And this was in a country where the tribes had gotten along for hundreds of years. So I started to look into why. And, of course, you now know because of the movie, the reason was diamonds. The best diamonds in the world are supposed to come from, not from South Africa, but from Sierra Leone. And what happened was the diamonds were illegally smuggled out with the help of Charles Taylor of Liberia, then the president of Liberia, and some other African dictators. The diamonds were smuggled out and sold in Belgium to the diamond merchants, and the money was used for guns, which armed guerrillas in the forests, and who then waged a 10-year civil war against the government of Sierra Leone. So I think if there hadn't been complicity on the part of the diamond merchants, if they hadn't supplied the money that was used to buy the guns, if they had a process, which they now have a process called the Kimberley process, which certifies diamonds as legal or illegal, and they're not supposed to buy them if they're illegal. But I think that this is a very good example of the complicity of the industrialized world in perpetuating this kind of very serious conflict. The Swiss banks, I mean, we've always heard about the Swiss banks, which have been repositories for many dictators all over the world, and now hundreds of thousands of dollars have been secreted in Swiss banks. And we now know that the Swiss banks were the banks for the Nazis during the Second World War. And that's the real reason Switzerland was able to maintain its neutrality. I'd always learned in graduate school that everybody had a little machine gun in his chalet, and that's how they maintained their neutrality. But that's not so. This banking was these numbered accounts in Swiss banks, which were the repositories for probably much of your foreign aid. Was one of the real reasons that Switzerland was allowed to maintain this neutrality. So I think that this is, were it not for the complicity of the industrialized world, and the United States is culpable as well, because we perpetuated the system, although it was Senator D'Amato and Stuart Eisenstadt that opened up, got more transparency out of the Swiss banks. But if it were it not for the United States Treasury notes, have been repositories for many dictators. You can buy them anonymously, or anonymously. The Treasury Department knows who owns them, but you can. In other words, you can have a safe haven for your money if you are corrupt and a violent dictator. So I think there's a certain amount of complicity which perpetuates these power relationships. And I remember interviewing somebody in the Treasury Department on this very subject. And he said to me, well, wouldn't you put your money here if you were in Argentina or wherever, money was being... and I said, of course I would, but I'm a lone individual, and I'm not asking you... What I'm asking you is, what should the policy of this country be? And, of course, the argument was if they don't put the money here, they'll put it somewhere else, and I think this calls for some sort of organization on the part of the industrialized countries to prevent this. The second political reason that I could see is the scapegoating of the weak. And in many of these conflicts that are perpetuated by dictators, you see the scapegoating of the weak. The Jews in Nazi Germany, for example, were selected by the leadership of the Nazi Party because they were weaker than the church, they were weaker than big business, and they were weaker than the Bolsheviks. So it was a sort of a horrible strategic decision. We also have the rise of technology, which is really the subject of another lecture, so I won't bore you with that today. But first of all, technology has made it much easier to communicate worldwide. So terrorists can organize on the internet. And the U.S., because of the U.S. policies on the First Amendment, we're knee-jerk First Amendment freaks in this country. We believe in free speech above all, and that the best ideas will win out. But how this translates into internet policy is very interesting, because we have the U.S. is now the most famous domain in the world for free speech. So the hate groups register their domains in the U.S. They're regulated in Germany, France, the European Union, but they're not regulated here. Anyone can open a domain here, and so that many of these hate groups spew their hatred from the United States. And I think that when this has led to murder, it's led to all kinds of organizing, and I think we've got to have some policy that addresses this. Communications revolution has also made it much easier for everyone in the world to see how the other half lives. And I think this causes a great deal of resentment. When I was teaching in Egypt, I was invited to give a free-for-all at Al-Azhar for girls. And I think that was one of the most wonderful experiences of my life, because they said to me, I don't think it could happen today, but at the time, the women said to me, well, you ask us any question you want, and we'll ask you any question you want. You want to hear about. So I said, good. And they said, you start. I said, well, why are you wrapped up in all these robes? You're doing what men want you to do. And they said, no, our parents were in Western dress. They were dressing in burqas and robes because of a pride in a pan-Islamic identity. And it had absolutely nothing to do with men. And they also said, we have no sexual harassment in the workplace. You do, because we're all covered up. And, it said we're on a much more equal plane. And then I said, well, what do you want to know from me? And they said, all we get here are Hollywood movies. Do you live in a mansion with servants and big swimming pools? And so I realized that the message we're sending out in the world is quite different. They see how the other half lives, and they think we all live like that. I said, no, let me describe my house. And I said, I live in a simple split level and whatnot and whatnot. And I said, we live better than you do, but we're nothing like what Hollywood is portraying us. Well, in conclusion, I'd like to talk about a few solutions here. Everybody says to me, what are we going to do? What can we do? And, of course, I always feel it's enough to just tell you what the problems are, but editors are always saying, okay, you need a chapter, you need some solutions, you need to tell us what to do, you need to tell people what to do. Well, I'm not sure I can do that, but there are a few solutions that come to mind as a result of what I've been talking about tonight. First of all, I think we have to recognize this defeat syndrome and downplay defeat and focus instead on reconstruction. And we've been very successful in the past. We certainly should have learned our lesson from MacArthur's occupation of Japan. We engaged in the Marshall Plan for Europe. We wanted to reconstruct Europe after it was so badly battered. We've even helped in the reconstruction of our enemies, Germany and Japan. So I think now it's not all altruism. We're not all altruistic because the Marshall Plan meant more markets for our products and our companies. So it's not all altruism, but there are many ways in which capitalism and good policy can work very well together. I think that the industrialized countries came together 2 years ago and decided on debt forgiveness for what they call the most heavily indebted countries, the poorest of the poor countries. So instead of crushing them with more and more debt, they forgave the debt, and I think that really is a step in the right direction. The second solution is one of that I, for want of a better word, can just call governance. I think we have to recognize that elections alone do not bring democracy. India has elections, but if you can have groups of Muslims or Hindus murdered on trains, hundreds of them, without the rule of law stepping in, then I'm not sure that country has really satisfied the requirements of democracy. The same is true of many countries in the world that have elections, but only one candidate. I always tell my students to always suspect that we have a lot of apathy in this country, as you know. Less than 50% of our electorate comes out to vote in a presidential election. And in 1960, 62% came. So we're definitely on a downhill slide. But in the former Soviet Union, 98% of the people voted. Does that mean democracy? Well, I always tell people to suspect, whenever they see a really high level of voter participation, to always suspect that either at the other end is either violence or even benign cases. I mean, in Australia, you're fined if you don't go out and vote. So many people manage to get to the polls. But the elections alone do not bring about democracy. It depends on who's running. If you had an election in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood would win. And many Egyptians don't want to see that happen. So there haven't been elections in that country. So you need to have the rule of law. I mean, Russia, of course, when the Soviet Union threw off the shackles of communism, you had, capitalism coming in, and it was really like the 19th century. It was like the Wild West, because you had capitalism, you had lots of privatization and companies coming in, but they didn't have the rule of law. So what good is it if you just have kind of rampant free market capitalism without laws to protect people engaging in it? Then, well, you know what occurred in the Soviet Union. I think to a large extent we have to anticipate wars. And then again, I use the example of Iraq, Shiites versus Sunnis. And Iraq, as you know, was a very artificial country to begin with. It was created at the end of World War I in a hotel room by Winston Churchill. So, should we have a tripartite? Should the country be divided? I'm not sure, because there are many intermarriages, people are living together. I'm not sure that that's a solution that's very good. I would like to see religious leaders organize, because religious leaders have very often had tremendous impact. Look at Martin Luther King in this country. Look at Bishop Tutu in South Africa. Look at the Dalai Lama's efforts. I'd like to see religious leaders today organize for much more moderation and answer some of the questions of fundamentalism that seem to hit the headlines. And where are the moderates? Where are the great religious leaders that could lead us out of some of these impasses? Another area that we could really work on is trade. I think trade is very important, and it does erase a lot of barriers. But one size does not fit all. And there are so many examples, and that's where the world is really, communications has made it much easier for people throughout the world to see that one size does not fit all. You can't privatize water in Bolivia and make people pay $400 a year when that's probably all they make, the poor in Bolivia. So the IMF and the World Bank have all these restrictions on their loans, and one of them, is the privatization or deregulation or any of these themes, but they don't really fit many of these countries. So I think there has to be a much more sophisticated approach to trade, and I think much of this hostility around the world would be tamped down if that really were implemented. And finally, I think, and I would like, this is real pie in the sky, I'd like to see tolerance implemented somehow. I don't know how you do it, but President Bush, he did do some good things, and one of the things that he and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice did was insist on conferences in Europe that were on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in Europe. Two real problems in the European community, and Europe wanted to sweep it under. The European countries wanted to sweep it under the rug, and he insisted that the conferences take place. The head of the OSCE conference is a Bulgarian who talked about how Bulgaria saved 50,000 Jews during World War II, the only country to do so. They just said no. And they refused to, they were able to say no. The only country in the entire, that part of the world that was able to save Jews and not permit them or not permit the Nazis to murder them. But tolerance is very important. Multiculturalism is very important. And I remember seeing a sweatshirt that said, "You don't get harmony when everyone sings the same note." So I think that I would like to see a lot more of that. And on that happy note, I will say good night to all of you. Thank you for coming. And I would be happy to take some questions. I think Dr. Stearns, thank you very much.